getting drunk. So what? Go, go somewhere else. If you don't like drink, go to another country. That's what we do here. It's every single time. There's a very, very worrying statistic in the Policy Exchange report of the percentage of young Muslims who think homosexuality should be made illegal, and that apostasy from Islam should be punishable by death. Those two things are not open for negotiation by the British state. There's no reason why British people should feel any shame about that. There is every reason why the argument should be taken to people who think that way.
But, I mean, you're allowed to believe that if you want to believe it. It doesn't mean what you're not allowed to do is enforce it. If people can have all kinds of strange political beliefs. It's a free country. What they should do, as long as they accept that, it's not something that is actually going to come for law, and that all they can do is try it, if those are their beliefs. And, for example, I have many, many, many Muslim friends, including people who you would view as quite radical in organizations like Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, who are quite radical, all of whom know I drink, and none of them hold it against me. They may think,
they will.
But this sounds like, I mean, Craig, this does sound like one of those old jokes you used to hear in Nazi Germany. Some of my best friends are Jewish, but...
Well, to be honest, at the end of the day, like I say, I work up and down the country. I'm engaging Muslim, but I've never met a Muslim person who says, "Oh, we should, try and, stop British people from drinking." I've never ever come across that. So that's why I question the policy exchange, and I don't know who they spoke to, but I really don't accept these figures, and I don't know where they came from, and it's just not true. It's just not a reality that Muslims in the UK are saying that, well, we want British people to stop drinking alcohol, and that's something that they want to force. It's a ridiculous assumption.
There is one area, though, where, not an attempt to enforce, but there's been strong, I mean, coming back to the foreign policy side, let's go back, we briefly touched upon it, you mentioned it, the sort of Palestine-Israel thing, the Lebanon issue last summer. Who can forget also at the time of that, and then we had the sort of alleged terror plot with the planes at that moment in time. What did we get after that terror plot? We had leading Muslim leaders come out and say, this is because of British foreign policy this has happened.
Yes. And might I add also that during that period, certainly poll after poll does show this is not just policy exchange poll after poll in this country shows the percentage of Muslims in this country who regard Jews as being legitimate targets for attack. It was an extremely worrying poll on that last year, which Melanie Phillips highlighted in her book. There's no coincidence between that and those young Muslims who put that into action. Anti-Semitic attacks in Britain alone went up 31% last year. 31%. And the number of Muslim people who are responsible for those attacks are wildly disproportionate for the percentage of Muslims living in this country. That is an example of them putting extremism into action.
Well, one point in terms of the Muslim leaders, it wasn't just the Muslim leaders that were saying about foreign policy. The Joint Intelligence Committee report that was produced for the Prime Minister also said as a result of the Iraq war, that is what has resulted in radicalization. So it wasn't only Muslim leaders that, had finally, in my opinion, came and were saying that as a result of foreign policy, but the Joint Intelligence Committee themselves, they said that. In fact, I think whether it's commentators, whether it's journalists, everybody, within society seems to now accept that as a result of foreign policy. I mean, you think about it, whether it's, a preacher or somebody goes into a Muslim area, no preacher or anyone can go into a Muslim area and say, oh, because, we don't like the fact that British people drink, or because they go out on a Saturday night, or because, they eat fish and chips, that we should strap on some explosives and get onto a bus. It's not a justification, but the only way that would get people angry is if somebody, they would get, those people would get, beaten up themselves and thrown out of the area. But if someone goes and is talking about what's happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in Palestine, these are the reasons why people get angry. I have to keep repeating, this is not a justification in any way, but that's the reasons why the anger is there. And people are, our survey again demonstrates, that I think a few percentage of people, but people are not against British values and democracy and freedom. This is a red herring. If Muslims were, last point, if it was the case that, all these Muslim extremists were against British values or Western values, why isn't Amsterdam the first place to get attacked?
I can assure you that you've made a mistake there. The radicalization of Muslim youth in Amsterdam is exceedingly worrying. Theo van Gogh was beheaded on the streets of Amsterdam by a young Muslim youth, working from a terror cell based in Amsterdam that fortunately was prevented before it blew up the headquarters of the Dutch intelligence service, the Dutch parliament, and Amsterdam airport.
I was going to say, I think...
Okay, now to make my next point, to make my next point on that, I think it's very important to stress two things on this. Firstly, this false notion that everything about foreign policy is behind us. One of the interesting things, perhaps the most interesting thing in the Policy Exchange report, was the analysis of what young Muslims in the survey knew. So all of the blowhard stuff about, I am doing this for my Muslim brethren in Palestine, do you know what tiny percentages of them could even name the Palestinian Prime Minister? The tiny number of them that could name Ehud Olmert. The tiny number that I think could even locate these areas on the map. This is a great problem at the moment because demagogic Muslim leaders and others are taking advantage of their opinions. They are telling them they should be enraged about this, that their Muslim brothers are being abused, and that they should be more angry. And a lot of them think in response, yeah, I'll wind myself up about it, and I'll wind other people up about it. But do they ever bother to know anything about it? Do they ever bother to find out? Do they even satiate even basic curiosity? No. And one other thing that comes from this that ought to be said, has to be said now, is this. What if this were to do with foreign policy? I don't think it is. But what if it were to do with foreign policy? So what? So what? Is the British state going to take dictation for its foreign policy from a tiny community within its midst? I don't think so.
Nobody's asking for a pro-Muslim foreign policy, a Muslim-friendly policy. What people want is a just foreign policy, a principled foreign policy, not one
that overthrew tyrants who were persecuting Muslim people in, for instance, Iraq.
In terms of what you were saying about Muslims not being aware of what's going on in Palestine, that's absolute nonsense. Muslims throughout are more politically aware today than they've ever been, whether it's about Iraq, and
maybe more than they've ever been, but not very much.
You don't have to know who's the president of, Iraq or of Palestine, or whether to feel
one thing. Okay,
if you was to ask the people in Britain who's the president of the Palestinian Authority or Israel, I'm pretty sure.
Hold on one second. Let's just look at the education issue for one thing. I mean, it is true, Craig, isn't it? Now, you were ambassador in a pretty far-off place. Most people won't have any clue what's going on in Uzbekistan, now, then, any point in time. It is true that there's a certain lack of education, for example, about what goes on in Egyptian jails, in Syrian jails, what life is like in Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. That's true. People don't really know the reality of that. That's not really being taught. So when people do come up with issues of, well, my brethren are being persecuted, for example, it's rather sort of gut feeling, isn't it, rather than based on fact?
Well, yes, no. I mean, the truth is that in Uzbekistan, we and the Americans were supporting a terrible dictator, just as bad as Saddam Hussein.
Which you quite rightly
arguably was. And that's the hypocrisy of a policy, if you like. And if we had a general policy of being against dictators in general, then, and the Saddam Hussein thing fitted into that context, you might understand it. But the fact is that we were supporting a dictator who practiced torture. And not only that, but under the extraordinary rendition program, we were complicit in the sending of people abroad in order to be tortured. And I think there's a real danger that we have lost the kind of the moral high ground, and we've lost...
Who to?
Well, to no one, sadly. I'm not claiming anyone else is more moral than we are, but we are undoubtedly much less moral than we were. I know, for example, nowadays we accept intelligence obtained under torture. I worked on Iraq during the first Gulf crisis, and I know for a fact that under the then government, led at the time by Mrs. Thatcher, we would not accept intelligence under torture because it arose. Some of these grievances are real. It in no way justifies terrorism. I'm not saying it does. But to pretend that Muslim people don't have real grievances doesn't help the argument.
Fine. Well, one final point. The debate's been flying so quick and fast. We haven't gone to normal pieces. A final point for you, Rahul. I mean, I think people should read your survey. I think it'd be very good to do so.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'd like to say. I mean, if you go to www.blink.org.uk, the survey's there. You can download it. It's a PDF version. And we would ask people just to have a look at that survey and see what the findings of that were.
Douglas, last thought?
Well, I mean, as I say, I come back to this thing, which is that even if any of these complaints were true, which they're not, even if they were true, at the moment the Prime Minister goes to Her Majesty the Queen to ask permission to use her armed forces. Are we really going to go to the Muslim Council of Britain to ask permission?
I think probably not. That was their view. This was Worldview. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks.